Welcome, everybody. Here we are, and there's a reason why I seem to be kind of standing in the woods. This is the Welcome to Middleborough's Historic Cemetery program, and I think this is the fourth of our little visits up, and the second when we're actually out in one of our cemeteries. So the reason I'm here in front of all this overgrowth behind it is that this is what the cemetery we're going to visit originally looked like. We are going to go to a cemetery that has no stones, a cemetery that was absolutely disappeared, despite being owned by the town, and has been a cemetery that I hope now can take some opportunity to learn from and experience and kind of have a look at a different time period in Middleborough's history. As we say, many of these places have stories to tell us, and that's really what we're hoping to do here. This program is going to be a little combination of history, clearly some cemetery lore, but almost also a little lesson in the botanics, the plant life of this area, because I tell you, we have been fighting the plant life of this area in order to get it back. So anyway, we are right now on public property. This belongs to the town of Middleborough. We are right off of Bridge Street, which is kind of right close to the Lakeville-Middleborough line, and we're also very close to the Ocean Spray Cranberry factory that is busy right now processing our local cranberries, and we'll get a shot and put that in there so you'll have some idea of where all this is. But many, again, people drive down this little street and have absolutely no idea that they are going by the final resting place of what are probably hundreds of folks who lived and died here in Middleborough. This is sometimes called the Alms House or the Poor Farm. Goes by a couple of terms. Even our local history books, they originally called it the Poor Farm and then the Alms House. Later on, it got yet a third name. It was called the Infirmary. And it really harkens back to a time when the most needy in our community, the destitute, the folks with no money, the place when folks with no place to live, the old and the sick and the infirm, were taken care of not by the federal government with the form of Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid. None of those things existed. We're not taken care of by the Commonwealth. Welfare as we know it today did not exist. And so almost every community of any size had what was called the Poor Farm. And the Poor Farm was just what it was, the name implied, the farm that took care of the poor. And the folks who needed it, especially in the winter months when it was cold and food was scarce, went and lived at the Poor Farm in many cases, or lived there for ongoing. If they could, they were asked to work and do the best they could. But this is what many New England and especially Massachusetts communities had, a poor farm to take care of those in greatest need. When you try and check on the history, the Murdy Remains history of Middleborough gives perhaps the best picture of what happened with the Poor Farm. Clearly they were servicing people in a private location way back into the early 1800s. But the very first formal structure of a Poor Farm was built in 1886. And they talk about folks going there, especially in the winter when it was cold and food was hard to get. Then there was a major fire in that structure in 1906, in April of 1906. 16 people were resident right then, but all were okay. Nobody was hurt by the fire. They decided to rebuild the Poor Farm at that point, and it was a big financial bite. It was going to cost all of $16,000, which in those days was a massive amount of money. $5,000 came from the town, and once again, our friends at Pierce Trustees helped out with an $11,000 contribution to rebuild the Poor Farm. They actually had a second fire in 1925. A little did not burn the place down, but it was repaired after that. It was about that time that it changed its name and became the Infirmary as compared to the Alms House. That carried on serving especially older people and unwed mothers and the sick and the infirm in town for another almost 30 years, because it was officially closed in January of 1957, and in 1966 the house itself was knocked down, razed, and actually set on fire. Now, they lived there and they died there and were buried on town property. And in many, many cases, we have lost track of that. Now, from Middleborough's historic records, the Poor Farm burials started in about 1831. Whether there had been things before that, not clear when I read our Middleborough histories, but the Poor Farm actually started having official burials that were listed in 1831. And the Thatcher book of Cemeteries of Southeastern Massachusetts has a whole list from the 1830s through the 1850s of the people who were buried here. Quite interesting because it gives you some picture of the variations culturally that were so different. Among those, he clearly lists the insane and the destitute and a whole variety of things that, again, we have different services for today. But when we first started exploring our cemeteries, behind me is what this place looked like. Overgrown, covered with poison ivy, covered with bittersweet, trees, all kinds of things that completely cover this area that is right between the railroad tracks and the ocean spray factory. So we're going to cut now, and we'll be right back and show you what this now looks like. Well, here we are now in front of the cemetery that is right here. Again, just pretty much looks like flat land. The little orange markers you see behind me are things that we, the cemetery friends, have placed here to mark where we can actually find graves. And I'll show you how we found them. When I first came down here, much of this was overgrown, as we saw before. I'll go over here and show you there's a little cemetery marker here, a concrete marker with a number on it. We'll show you that closer in a little bit. But when I came, one of those was all I could see for a marker when I first came here. And all of this area behind us was quite overgrown and covered, as I said, with poison ivy and bittersweet and small trees and all kinds of things. I want to give credit to a couple of groups. One is our own cemetery friends, because we, for a number of times, came and did a lot of cleanup of this area and continue to do that. I just cut the grass here 2 or 3 days ago, and so we provide some ongoing care. I also want to credit Ocean Spray, because Ocean Spray, when we were kind of connecting to them and just asking for a little help if they could provide it, they had a cleanup crew that came here and did some major work in this area, taking out some of the biggest obstacles to clearing this area, and with that, it made it much more open. So right behind me, as I say, is marked about something in the range of 50 to 60 graves, and we've tried to mark each one. It is very likely there may be more than that here. I must admit that I get confused about whether this is the Almshouse Cemetery, which I think it is, or the Infirmary Cemetery, or maybe it doesn't matter. They're really the same ongoing thing, the Almshouse being the earlier one, the Infirmary being the later name for it. Our records, as I say, start talking about burials from 1830 on, and clearly from what we hear, they were burying people up into the 40s at one or the other of the cemeteries involved. There are two, this cemetery, and then across the way, across the railroad tracks, another location that we cannot find any markers in, cannot see any kind of a pattern. But this one clearly has lines of graves, and they are numbered. And so you can see these orange markers, which we've placed along the way, and there are about 4 or 5 rows of these as we go back, which are clearly marking markers, showing markers that are down at ground level. In fact, in many cases buried 3, 4, 5 inches below ground level now, that are cement. Don't quite know how far down they go, but cement, I wouldn't call them posts because they don't stick up, but markers there. And inside of them are on top of them are little numbers. We, again, in trying to figure out who's where, have been trying to see if someplace there's a connection between the numbers and a person's name. We can't find that listed someplace. I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere in the records of the town of Middleborough there is something that makes a connection between these numbers and an individual person. So we're going to take a look at a couple of those things, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how quickly this could go right back to what we started with, which was a completely overgrown area, and that's where we'll get into a little bit of botany as well as some of the other interesting things about that spot. So welcome to what is probably the Almshouse Cemetery. Here I am, and I'm at grave site number 20. You can tell, again, this has its own marker. This one happens to be a little higher than almost all of them are, and quite clear so you can see it. But it shows you how quickly and how easily the underbrush could quickly come back into this area if it isn't maintained in some way. So we're going to take a little bit of time and do a little bit of botany lesson about the invasive, in some cases, forms of plant life that are really rampant around here and would, if this place isn't maintained, take it over and turn it right back into the jungle that it was, because some of these are incredibly invasive characteristics of their growth, and we'll talk about them. There's a little stump right here in front of this one that, had it been allowed to grow for another 15 years, would be as big as some of the other trees that are right here. So right here is where a person was buried, who knows how long ago, and that again was completely lost in the overgrowth of plants that were here. And you can see behind me how quickly, if we step back and don't take care of these areas, this will be overgrown. We can't find another line of graves back there. It's very quickly that you hit the drop off for the railroad, and that railroad was there a good long time ago. So it's most likely that we think this is the first line of graves out of the 4 or 5 lines that are here. So we're going to now move on and do a little bit of botany about some of the things that are so likely to take this area back. You can see behind me that we're right beside the roadway here, and this cemetery is right beside the road. Little embankment behind, and then a stone wall, and the cemetery seems to go right up to it. Now, in our cleanup one of these times, we did cut some of this back, but my grass cutting of the other day, I didn't get over here to quite this part, and you can already start seeing how quickly the grasses move in and start taking things over. And within the grasses, there are other things that come along. This is going to be a big thing we'll talk about. This is a plant that is a major player. It's an invasive. It's not a local. This is something that came from somewhere else in the world. This is bittersweet, and we'll talk about that much more in a little bit. But you can see that vine starts coming along. There are trees that come along. I'd like to show you an interesting grave that's right here. This is, I believe, grave number 4 it's talking about. And you can see that there's a real indentation in the ground here. There's the marker. Person was buried here. Back to the things coming along, there's a tree starting to grow here that we'll take out. I kind of left it for you to see it. But this quickly will become a tree, much like some of the others that are here, if it isn't taken out and removed. This is most likely an unusual grave in that this person was probably buried in a coffin. When you see this kind of collapse at a grave site, it is usually when the structure of the coffin finally, with moisture and the years go by, collapses, and then the ground falls into that space. And so this is most likely a collapsed coffin. What's unusual is that this person had a coffin. As we've heard and believed to be the case, most people were just wrapped in canvas and then buried in the ground here at this location. So a bit unusual. So one of our spots, but it does indicate how quickly a spot like this would first grow to grasses, and then the trees invade along with the aggressive vines. We'll show you a couple of those. This is grave number 12 by the marker, and it just shows you again the progression that can happen, and it looks very minimal right now, but there are 3 young bittersweet plants here. They all have most likely sprung from seeds that were dropped by birds that would have sat on the branches above and then dropped down these seeds, and they start sprouting, and they don't look like much now. But I'm going to show you what happens to these within 2 or 3 years. These could be completely covering this area and climbing the trees nearby. So they are very, very aggressive growers, and we'll show you what kinds of things can happen if they're not removed. We will remove these, but if they're not removed, they take over. Here's our little bittersweet baby that was at grave number 12. This is what this would have become given just maybe 2 or 3 years. This is bittersweet, growing up a maple tree. The tangle it becomes goes up through this area and completely overwhelms this tree, ultimately will kill it. But while the tree stands, it will grow and aggressively take over that area, and you can see over time pretty much makes kind of an impenetrable growth of materials that are very difficult to get through and do much with. So this is what it becomes if we don't take care of it and keep it from going from this to that. This just kind of indicates where this ultimately goes. Right behind me is a tangle of large bittersweet that has been allowed to grow. Here's again another stem. And believe it or not, these plants will actually kill something as big as this tree behind me. They grow up, overwhelm it, cover its leaves, shade it so that the tree doesn't get its nutrients and finally will die. But this is what takes over. And again, this is an outside invader. This is not even a native plant. Now on top of that, there are other delights and joys that take over this place. Poison ivy is another one, and all kinds of things. But all of our historic cemeteries have this ongoing problem. They need continuous care. Even just as simple as 2 or 3 times a year, which is all this one gets, cutting the grass. So those are the things that we do. We're looking for help and support in doing that, and we're glad to have people volunteer, if you're a neighbor, to perhaps take over the care of a historic cemetery like this and keep it from going back to the wild that has happened to it in the past and part of our history. Here's our last little bittersweet lesson. Removing bittersweet, first cutting it helps, but it will pop right up out of the ground. The best way, if you can, is when it's relatively small, pull it out of the ground. And the way you can really tell bittersweet is it has these nice orange roots. So if you see a vine like this, you pull at it a little bit and it has orange roots, that's bittersweet, and it's not a good guy to have around. And while we're at it, one last little piece of botanical information is here on one of our trees in the cemetery is the return of poison ivy. Now, many of us know leaves are 3, let it be. Here's just a little something else for you. It's kind of a public service, and that is, how can you get rid of poison ivy without getting poison ivy? Well, the message is, that I've been told anyway, oils on the leaves are the problem, so stay away from the leaves. But if you can go down and get a hold of the stem, which is what I'm doing, and pull it up, we hope that what I've been told works and I won't get poison ivy. So I'll let you know on a future show if that's indeed the case. But poison ivy is another problem here because it can so quickly take over. At least it's a native. It's one that has been here for hundreds or thousands of years, but bittersweet not. So that's it on our botanical lessons. I'm just right here at one of these grave locations to show you one of these markers and give you some kind of idea on the orientation. This one, you can see here, has a cement, clearly a cement square-like shape to it. We haven't dug down to know how far down this is, as the cemetery friends have put these markers here just so we can find these. They're so much at ground level, it's very easy to have these get covered and kind of lost again. And almost all of these were lost. We went around, once you see the pattern, you can start kind of figuring out where one ought to be, and then we poke around to discover that, yes, indeed, there is one. Now, each one of these, from the orientation, seems to be connected to a grave that was buried in this orientation. So I'm kind of kneeling on where the person was probably buried. And right behind me you might see that we have some trees. Most likely this was an open field, and all these trees have grown up in the 30, 40, 50 years of this time. And because, as I say, this was probably no longer cared for after the 30s or 40s as far as being part of an ongoing town program. So fairly large trees have grown up through this area over that time period. And so this is what we could find 1 or 2 of, and then when we really started looking and clearing out and poking around, have discovered that there are 4 or 5 lines, 1, 2, 3, 4 lines, each one with about 15 or 16 or 17 graves quite clearly marked. Still, we don't know who number 11 was, unfortunately. We've lost that connection, and we'll keep looking for it. We may be able to find who these people actually were. But that's the basic orientation of this layout with people buried here. Most of them, from everything we can find out, they had very limited resources. This is not something where people had coffins. It is most likely that these people were wrapped in canvas and buried in the ground here. That it was unlikely that most of them had anything other than that. I understand that there was not even a minister who was connected to this program who came and said anything on these burials. But all in all, at least they were cared for somewhat by the community, cared for medically somewhat as well, and then placed with some respect into Middleborough soil. We've just come across the tracks to give you just a very quick picture of the other cemetery that is part of this. Again, belongs to the town of Middleborough. I think this one is the Infirmary Cemetery, the one that was active in the 20s, 30s, and 40s that we heard about, so that the latest burials were here. And it gives you an idea of how difficult it is to find these places once they have completely reverted back to the forest that is what is by nature the normal form of life around here. This is completely overgrown. We've tromped around back here, we being the cemetery friends, and can find no pattern to stones or anything else. So it may well be that I'm standing in front of a cemetery of several hundred citizens of the community who lived and died here at the infirmary in its later years, were buried here, and have absolutely nothing that marks their passing at this point. Including in that may well be the burial of a goodly number of babies who were unfortunately did not survive their birth in many cases and were buried here. So it's a kind of a tragic end for many, and in this case left with unmarked locations as compared to the few that we saw over there. So we may have 50 or 60 marked graves over on the almshouse side of it, but the infirmary side we can find none. And it's likely that these two cemeteries, as I said, house hundreds of folks who were part of a town's attempt to provide a home, medical services to the most needy. You know, when you come to a place like the Infirmary Cemetery here, you know, one of the things that's unusual is how do you get information on a place like this? You know, as we said, this place is apt to get lost in the weeds and the overgrowth of plants, but historically, how do you find things? And one of the great things about New England small towns, and Middleborough specifically, is that frequently there are sources, and those sources can be people who actually lived it a bit, and other sources that we can find because towns have to keep records. And frequently, because this was a town-owned and town-run facility, there are bits of information. So we're going to turn to a couple of those things to see if we can get a little background about this place and fill in some of the blanks that most of us either never knew or lost over the years and years and years since this place became the overgrown location that it became. So we'll fill you in on a couple of bits of history. I'm very, very pleased this morning to have somebody to help us with some of the background on this, because this location, as we mentioned earlier, you know, is really kind of the place where some of our most needy and destitute folks of the community ended up. But I wanted to hear a little more about what happened, so I was very fortunate to find that there was a local gentleman here, Doug McLean. Welcome, Doug, who has some connections to the early days of these services and of this location. Doug, tell us a little bit about, you know, what your family had to do here and you know, how you got not connected personally, but how you knew of this place.
My grandfather, Wallace Grant, and Marty Grant, his wife, made it their living servicing the town farms. Came from East Bridgewater to Middleborough to North Attleboro. 4 years in East Bridgewater, about 10 years in Middleborough, and 4 years in North Attleboro.
So they were basically running whether we call it poor farm or almshouse or infirmary or whatever it was, they were running it here.
Yes.
They didn't live here, they just came
No, they lived here.
They lived here too. Okay, you didn't live here though, but
no.
they did.
Yes.
Okay, good. And we are now standing with our backs to the trains, and right over here is the big factory of Ocean Spray. Where was the almshouse, poor farm, whatever you want to call it, compared to where we are right now?
Over on the curve.
So over that way?
Over on the curve, over there.
Okay. And so all this land was really kind of quite back from there, but the whole area was quite large.
Oh, yes, it was large.
Okay.
This was very large.
And the kinds of things, if you came and lived in the almshouse or poor farm, what kinds of things were you able to receive there? Because these people were pretty desperate in most cases, and if they came, especially in the winter, what kind of services could they get?
They were housed here.
Mm-hmm.
They were housed here, from what I understand.
Right.
But mostly, when my grandparents were here, these people were sick.
Okay.
Very
Because
sick.
by that time, as I understand, the almshouse idea of just a place to live had actually somewhat morphed into the infirmary, it was called.
Yes.
And the infirmary was much more of a medical facility. And as I understand it, there were folks very often either elderly or with medical issues or in special need of medical services who were often getting the services then.
Yes, but also they were getting. There was two. It was a two-prong approach.
Mm-hmm.
You got the people that had nothing that were living here,
Right.
but people that were able to do it, for example, would cut firewood
Okay.
and stack it up. Now, you could either use the firewood was given to the people who had labored here.
Mm-hmm.
Two, if they needed food, they would go to Bay O'Toole's. They were given coupons,
Okay.
and they could go to Bay O'Toole's store,
Huh.
which was down. I'm trying to think where the barber shop is on South Main Street.
So if you came to work here in some ways, you might get things that would let you not necessarily have to
If
live
you
here,
couldn't
but
afford
get
it.
support and live outside of the poor
Yes,
farm and the
yes.
almshouse. Interesting, quite amazing. So, but there were also this medical side of it was also very much a part of it. If you had medical needs, you might
Yes.
live here and get those medical needs met. And I understand one of the groups that sometimes had to come here were unwed mothers who were having a baby, and in the days when that was a very upsetting thing, they
Right.
could come here and get medical
Right.
services, among those other
That's right.
things. Well, it's amazing to hear all those kinds of differences. Tell me, another thing I hear is about, quote, the pig farm. And the pig farm was, as I understand it from talking with you earlier, really kind of a component of the program
This
here.
was part of it because it fed the people.
Okay.
It
And
fed
so
the
they'd
people.
collect garbage from around town,
That's right.
feed the pigs, and
Right.
some of the people getting services could, if they could work, could support that effort.
That was a whole. This was a whole communal. I guess you could almost say it a communal service, if you could think of it that way.
Right. And serving some of the, obviously the neediest and most destitute folks in the community. All right, let's shift into that last part, and that is that unfortunately for many, this was the location where they ended their lives came to an end.
Yes.
And with that, from the research we've done and the things we spoke of a little earlier, there seem to have perhaps been two cemeteries. We're standing in front of one, but where was the other?
The other one was across the tracks behind us.
Okay, so
Now,
that really more over on the Middleborough side. We're kind of on the Lakeville side of the railroad tracks here.
How I found out about
yeah.
that is I came in on a conversation between Colonel Grant and his sister,
Okay.
Lillian McLean,
Yeah.
and she said, "Here's where the cemetery is." He says, "Yes, it's here, but there's another one."
Which meaning that one
It was
over
across.
there.
He pointed right directly across the tracks.
Okay.
He says, "Here." Well,
Right.
she says, "How do you know?"
Yeah.
I dug the holes.
So he was
dug the
he
graves.
actively was the
Right.
grave digger for the community.
And then her question, no, she just asked questions right after another.
Yeah.
How did you get the bodies up to the grave?
Yeah.
We used a pushcart. Why did you use a pushcart? Pushcart because a horse would be spooked by the trains.
Very practical.
That's
Now, at the same time, I bet they had very little by way of other resources, so I would assume people were not buried in coffins and all the kinds of things that we would think is more appropriate for a burial of those
that
days.
question was asked. It's strange how I can remember this. He said, whatever we had,
Okay.
from lumber to canvas to cloth.
We have the Cemetery Friends group have gone over and looked at the area that on the maps show this cemetery. We can find no markers. This cemetery right here, we can find markers and numbers and a few other things. We have trouble identifying who the numbers connect to as far as the people there. But when we go over and look at the one that may well be what is called the infirmary cemetery, you might call, where perhaps, again, some of the elderly, older folks who died or anyone with medical issues, and also perhaps any of the babies and mothers who were there because of the shame of unmarried pregnancy. These kinds of folks are buried over there, and we can find at this point no markers, no pattern of graves, nothing at this point to indicate other than on the map where that cemetery is. But which leads us to assume this cemetery, if that's the one he was using, in what time period would you say that was? Probably
I would guess between 1930 and 1940.
Okay. So in the 30s and 40s, that area across the way was being used for burials.
Right.
This probably preceded that at that point. Well, Doug, thank you very much. You kind of help us get some concept of what this place really was and what services it provided. And so I appreciate very much your being with us today.
You're welcome.
Well, here we are, and I've got a special friend. This is my special friend, Susie Sherman, and Sue is part of our Friends of Middleborough Cemeteries group, but also one of our most effective both genealogical researchers and also historic researchers. So Sue has done a little research, and what are you finding in town records, and where have you gone in order to get information for us?
Well, it's been very interesting. Although I've spent some time at the town hall looking at death records for the 1900s, the major part of the work that I've done has been with Ancestry.com, where they have the Middleborough town records for the Arms Cemetery and the infirmary.
Okay. And this one we're quite sure is the infirmary cemetery.
This is definitely the infirmary
The Arms
cemetery.
Cemetery, we're quite sure, is behind us across the railroad
Yep.
tracks, and you even have some questions about where that is.
Exactly, because there's a map, but that's another story. So what we've found here is that the first burial was in 1933, and tragically it was the death of a stillborn, well, it was a stillborn child, a pair of twins that, would be buried right over there, or not. They could be buried in the back.
Yeah.
Because there's another place here where infants were buried as
That's all right, go ahead.
where infants were buried in a circle. Rather tragic again, but
Well-
they were around a stone post that's at the back of the cemetery.
We'll have we'll have a chance to get a closer look at that in a little bit. But there are, because I thought, and we had earlier on not been able to make connections, but you are finding in this ancestry connection about town records that are up there that we may very well have names for some of these people who are in our marked locations
It
here.
does seem that after the 1930s, when that first burial was made, that there are names for the first few numbers here. And whether there were any after the 1953 date of the last burial or not, the place where we're standing right now has numbers, but Doug McLean made the statement that the reason that they didn't bury here, first of all, was that they couldn't get their horse and buggy in that they use sometimes. And the second reason was that they ran into huge rock under here, so there may be bedrock beneath the area where we're standing.
So while they located it as a cemetery location, they ran into problems as they got into it.
That's right.
So, this is apparently then the location for the burial ground of folks in the later years of that process. The almshouse or poor farm, heard by both terms, seems to have had its burial location across the tracks over there.
That's correct.
And from what we know, you've saw something or other about at least 70 burials
That's
or so.
right. The Thatcher's, Charles Thatcher's book, the Southeastern Massachusetts Cemeteries, his record states simply 70 or so rough stones recorded the location of burials.
And we can't find any pattern to those stones
No,
or
we
anything
haven't
else
found
clearly yet
anything.
as we look over there. So 70 or so, and that's back in the almshouse poor farm time
Right.
of the history.
In the 1850s
more modern
and on, from
from
when
1930s
this location was
up
here.
until the end of Middleborough serving
Right.
its poor in this way up into the 50s. This is the location.
In 1966, this piece of property was turned over, most of it was turned over to industrial land. And the town actually didn't realize until I went into the records over in Plymouth that we own, as a town, this little piece of property. Oh, and if we looked behind, I'm looking at the Ocean Spray plant. If you want to know where we are, we're right on Wood Street, and it's a very lovely little location.
Well, thank you. That gives us much more information than we had earlier. And again, this is the kind of thing that is available to us and to all of us in the community. If you have old Middleborough ties, very much now, the internet is a great source of information.
And Friends of Middleborough Cemeteries,
Yes.
our cemetery, friendsofmiddleboroughcemeteries.org, has a lot of interesting information, and we're interested in what you have to offer as well.
So if you know more than what we've come up with so far, don't hesitate. I'm in the phone books, Friends of Middleborough Cemeteries. Glad to hear from you, and we have regular meetings, and so feel free to connect with us. Thank you,
Yes.
Susie, very much.
Oh, you're welcome, Jeff. It was my pleasure.
Good. Okay, and Sue's got for us here a map of the way things were in the old days, but let me kind of bring us up to date as to what exists right now, just to get people oriented. This is a railroad track, still is, and this is, I believe, what
Wood
street is
Street.
that? It's Wood
This is
Street
Wood
that comes
Street.
over.
Yep.
Up here is where 495 is now.
That's right.
But anyway, Wood Street coming over the railroad track, and we right now are right down here. This is what we're quite sure is the Infirmary Cemetery.
Yeah,
But Sue,
that's
take
correct.
over and point out other things that are here.
Well, the things that are now replaced by Ocean Spray, which is in here and in here, and this is not Ocean Spray, this is the river, are barns and a garage that were part of where they did store the hay, because these folks who were here did work to get something to take care of them while they were there. This is the infirmary itself, which was earlier called the almshouse, and it was more of a hospital for people who were, had dementia or not well,
Right.
or who couldn't, say, go to the hospital.
And that
to have a
happened
baby.
especially after about 1925.
Yeah,
And
that's right, and
also-
up
right.
until the 50s.
Right.
And it was raised in 1966. We have a record of that in the newspaper. This is where the piggery was, and this was along the river. They raised the pigs, took all the town garbage in. That's information that Butch Bell told us about. And I have pictures of him on the tractor right here, working to get the hay in for the season. So
that's kind of the orientation. This is
it.
where the almshouse, poor farm was, later called the infirmary. Now all of this is Ocean Sprayish
That's right.
area, and all of this is gone from the 60s on past.
But we were
still.
this was saved in 1966 and is owned by the town.
So, Infirmary Cemetery, probably the almshouse cemetery across the tracks over on the other side, though we have trouble locating exactly where that is.
That's right.
I'm way back here at the very back of the Infirmary Cemetery in what may well be the location of the very first graves. And from records, again, that Susie Sherman has been able to find, it would appear that the first burials here were in 1933, when this was clearly no longer called the almshouse or poor farm, but the infirmary area, and this being the Infirmary Cemetery. And from everything we can find, these little markers may well have been the markers for a series of graves for infants, stillborn children who were born, in many cases in all these cases, did not survive their birth or were stillborn on birth. And so right here, this tree has grown up since that time, obviously, and you can see this is completely swamped by bittersweet and other plants that are taking over. So we're going to come in and probably do a little cleanup around here. We may or may not ever take down a tree like this, but right here, these two little cement markers, maybe that's all that's left of a number of babies who were buried in this area, and were perhaps the earliest of the burials here. Later on, they became individual marked areas with numbers, and we are starting to find out who those folks are, but a number of babies buried right here. I'm obviously holding a sign here that does not for this cemetery. The Friends of Middleborough Cemeteries received a Community Preservation Act grant to start producing signs for some of our historic cemeteries. And the first one we've done, and we'll be placing in location soon, is this one for the Soul Street Smallpox Cemetery. I bring it out and have you take a look at it only because we're hoping that we're going to be able to place a sign that is appropriate for this cemetery. And hopefully either place it right here where kind of I'm standing, or perhaps better up near the road where by putting it up near the road, people will have some idea that this location is here. You may hear cars going by. People, hundreds of cars every day go by this area, have absolutely no idea this is here. So we're hoping that by raising the visibility of this location, making people aware that it's here, by programs like this, making people understand how our community wrestled with the needy and their problems, and now the reality of what it takes to continue to care for these locations if we don't want to lose them again, that signs like this will make these areas much more visible, much more a part of our community than they have been, because candidly they were lost, completely gone. And now we're trying to bring them back, make us aware of them, learn the lessons they have to teach us, and hopefully keep them as part of Middleborough's rich history. So we will try and have a sign for this cemetery in place before long. Thank you for being with us.